welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's to cut through the noise, really get into a massive stack of sources that detail this incredibly close and often aggressive link between law, judicial roles, and frankly, raw political power in the ancient world. We're going to be dissecting how mastering legal procedure, whether that was through, brilliant rhetoric or just sheer bureaucratic control, was never simply about abstract justice. It was fundamentally the tool for getting and keeping political dominance. And we'll see this across very different ancient systems.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it really takes us on quite a journey, doesn't it? We're starting in the very contentious agonistic heart of Athenian democracy. Where winning a court case often meant destroying a political rival. And then we're moving all the way forward to the sophisticated, highly centralized legal machine of the Roman Empire. There, power flowed, much more directly from the emperor's ability to issue decrees, edicts, and control the entire judiciary. And what really frames this whole discussion, I think, is this core tension they lived with in antiquity. The line between political action, which is, let's face it, driven by the very human chase for honor and gain and formal legal procedure, which is supposedly about justice, well, that line was incredibly thin, often almost non-existent.
Right.
And when that line blurred or just dissolved completely, it led straight to widespread civic conflict, what the Greeks called stasis. Our sources really track this trajectory beautifully, starting way back with the foundational homicide laws of Draco in the 7th century BCE.
Wow, that far back.
Oh, yes. And going right up to the complex imperial jurisdiction, you see detailed in later Roman legal collections, like Justinian's Digest.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this, starting in the Greek polis. That seems like the place where this mix of politics and law was maybe most volatile. If we look right at the heart of Athenian society, what was it fundamentally that drove this political conflict, this stasis in such close quarters?
Well, the great philosopher Aristotle, he really gave us what's probably the definitive answer. And it's rooted in moral psychology. He argued that men resort to stasis basically out of a very core set of drives.
Okay.
The desire for honor and gain, right?
Yeah.
Or, on the flip side, the fear of dishonor and loss. It's essentially a constant status competition that dictates how people perceive equality or fairness and when they feel the need to challenge it.
So it's not just like an argument over tax policy or something. It's deeply personal, a status fight over who deserves what in the public eye.
Precisely. And you can break down this motivation into maybe two main psychological drivers. The first one is pretty straightforward: acquisition and avoidance. Men strive aggressively for honor and gain because, well, they want them, and they react, often violently, when they fear losing them.
Makes sense.
But the second driver, and this is the one that's inherently destructive, really potent in creating stasis, is envy.
Envy. Okay, how does that play out in actual political action? What does that look like on the ground?
So in this context, envy isn't about, I want to be better like him. It's much more about destruction. It's seeing someone else get a bigger share of honor, power, wealth, whatever, and having this immediate visceral desire to deprive them of that prosperity.
Wow.
It's divisive by its very nature. And Aristotle specifically observed that men typically resort to stasis against officials who show extreme arrogance. Hubris, or this desire for excessive greedy, shares what they called pleonexia.
Pleonexia?
Yes.
Oh.
So if a magistrate clearly seems to be grabbing way too much power, too much wealth, and by doing so dishonoring his fellow citizens, well, he's basically pouring gasoline on the fire of potential civil unrest.
That desire to, as you said, aggressively deprive a rival of his prosperity, that really provides the psychological bedrock.
Yep.
And then Athens basically institutionalized that into its legal system. It makes total sense then that the courtroom in Athens so often just felt like a formalized, sanctioned extension of a personal fight.
Oh, absolutely. And the Athenians, they were famously, almost comically self-aware of just how litigious they were. Remember that fantastic scene in Aristophanes' play, The Clouds?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Well, the character Strepsiades is looking at a map, and someone points to a spot and says, "That's Athens." And Strepsiades just cannot believe it. Why? Because, he says, he doesn't see any law courts in session from that angle.
That's brilliant.
It perfectly highlights this cultural self-awareness. Athenian political life meant constantly being in court or threatening to go to court.
Okay, so if they're constantly dragging each other into court for these, status reasons, how did they legally justify what was at its core personal aggression? How did they make it look legitimate?
Rhetoric. Constant, sophisticated rhetoric. The topos, that's the sort of rhetorical commonplace or theme of revenge, was just universally deployed to justify lawsuit.
Revenge.
So a speaker in court would always set up this stark contrast, this antithesis. He'd argue, look, my use of the courts is legitimate. It sanctioned revenge for a wrong done to me or maybe to the state. And he'd contrast that sharply with his opponent's lawsuit, which he'd dismiss as purely illegitimate aggression, malicious prosecution, sycophantia. And what's more, the legal requirements for politicians themselves quickly blended with their overall civic status. Orders, the big names like Aeschines and Demosthenes, they completely understood that a jury's decision wouldn't hinge only on the specific facts of the case before them.
Right, it's bigger than that single charge.
Much bigger. They always emphasized that laws should look both towards abstract justice, sure, but also, crucially, towards the practical advantage this imperon for the city itself. So when you were trying to win a case, you basically put your entire life on trial. You focused heavily on proving which litigant was the better citizen, who had provided more for Athens.
How exactly did they, quantify being the better citizen in a courtroom setting? What did that look like?
You quantified your service. You literally listed the public contributions you'd made. They focused particularly on liturgical services. These were those incredibly expensive duties required of the wealthy citizens, like funding a warship for a year or paying for a dramatic chorus.
Right, the liturgies.
And also aisphora payments. These were special war taxes levied in times of need. So they'd stand up and essentially tell the jury, look at my record, my life, my contributions are demonstrably more valuable to the state than my opponents. Therefore, you must rule in my favor, not just for me, but to protect the city's investment in me.
That is just profound. Your entire civic identity, your financial and military contribution to the city's health literally determines your legal fate, not just the evidence related to the specific alleged crime.
Exactly. And all this political heat, this constant friction, it actually drove necessary legal clarifications over time. Think about the constant political turmoil in the late 5th century BCE, especially after those brief but incredibly violent oligarchic revolutions in 411 and then again in 404.
Right, the 30 tyrants and all that.
Precisely. When the democracy was restored after those upheavals, they were forced to systematically re-examine and, crucially, reaffirm their legal code. They focused very heavily on homicide law. They recognized, quite wisely, that to restore any kind of stability, they needed a legal bedrock that everyone respected, or at least accepted, and that bedrock fell to Draco's homicide law, which was ancient even then, dating all the way back to 621 or 620 BCE.
Draco's law, still relevant centuries later.
Incredibly so. It was specifically reaffirmed after both of those oligarchic episodes, precisely because it offered a stable, foundational approach to handling the most volatile form of civic conflict imaginable: murder. It was seen as a cornerstone of the democratic order.
So that ancient law provided a sense of stability, but what about the immediate practical problem of actually arresting a suspected killer, especially if people feared it was, say, a political assassination? How did the system handle that tension between needing quick justice and ensuring due process?
That's where it gets tricky. That tension really revolved around this concept called apagoge. It means summary arrest. Now, this was originally applied to a range of offenses, things like theft caught red-handed.
Okay.
But extending it to suspected killers required immense legal scrutiny and careful definition. The key legal constraint, the absolute rule, was that the suspect had to be apprehended epic autophora.
Epic autophora, meaning...
manifestly or caught in the act, literally on the crime itself.
But wait, being caught manifestly in the act? That sounds almost impossible for a premeditated murder, right? Which is often done discreetly, not out in the open. How did the Athenian political class, who needed to prosecute rivals, deal with a standard that seems almost too rigid for the crime?
This is exactly where you see the legal system becoming a tool of, well, rhetorical interpretation, and sometimes outright manipulation. Demosthenes, who was a central figure in many high-profile political prosecutions, clearly found the need to prosecute alleged killers more pressing than the strict letter of the law technically allowed.
So he bent the rules.
He knew the ip autophora rule was firmly established, couldn't just ignore it. So instead, he adopted a much looser, arguably politically convenient interpretation of it, specifically for homicide cases.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was Demosthenes' strategic reinterpretation of caught in the act? How did he define it?
He essentially paraphrased ape autophoroi, not as, catching the killer with a bloody knife in hand, but as simply seeing the accused killer circulating in the temples or around the agora after the crime was known to have occurred.
Wait, just seeing them walking around town?
In his courtroom arguments, yes. Appearing publicly after the act, in his version, could qualify as being manifestly known to the community as the killer. It implied a kind of brazenness, perhaps.
That's brilliant legal sophistry, isn't it? He effectively manipulated the legal language. He sidestepped the really strict standard used for crimes like, say, seduction or theft, where being caught in the physical act was absolutely essential. And by doing that, he made it far easier to bring politically charged murder cases before the courts.
Precisely. It was a pragmatic recognition, perhaps, that homicide, being the ultimate potential source of stasis, needed a legal procedure that could accommodate political reality, even if that meant stretching or maybe redefining the original meaning of the legal text.
Okay, let's broaden our view now. Moving beyond just Athens, let's look at the wider Greek world. Because law and alliances were constantly being leveraged, manipulated by the major powers, Sparta, Thebes, Athens, as they vied for hegemony. You mentioned initially the Persian threat actually fostered a bit of unity.
It did, briefly. That external threat forced a rare moment of, well, relative cohesion, the Panhellenic Confederacy, based around the Isthmus of Corinth. And in that coalition, Sparta was the undisputed leader, at least initially on land.
Their military reputation preceded them.
Absolutely. Spartan command was recognized across northern Greece without much dispute. And crucially, Spartan admirals held the ultimate naval authority at those defining battles against Persia, like Salamis and Mycale. They were top dog.
But, as often happens, once that immediate external threat started to recede, Sparta's apparent commitment to, Panhellenic ideals seemed to just evaporate. It turned into pure, cynical power politics. The seizure of Thebes you mentioned earlier sounds like a truly shocking example of using a legal or even religious context to pull off a hostile political takeover.
It really is a textbook case of hypocrisy and blatant legal manipulation. You have the Spartan general, Phoebus. He's supposedly just passing through Boeotia with his army, but he coordinates secretly with the pro-Spartan faction within Thebes, led by the polemarch Leontiadus.
Okay.
And together, they seize the Cadmea, which is the citadel of Thebes, its strategic heart. And the timing is critical. This happens during the Feast of Thesmophoria.
The Thesmophoria, wasn't that a major religious festival, and wasn't the citadel specifically given over to the women of Thebes during that time?
Exactly right. It was a sacred time, a women's festival. So this was a literal violation of sacred space, exploiting a moment of civic vulnerability, purely for political and military gain. It was outrageous. The immediate question then was what consequence Sparta would face for this egregious breach of sacred law, never mind the peace treaty supposedly in effect.
Given they were the dominant power, I suspect the consequence wasn't exactly severe.
Severe. It was minimal and deeply cynical. Sparta put on a show of condemning Phoebus. They levied a fine against him, 100,000 drachmae, which sounds like a lot, but it was framed as merely punishment for indiscretion, not for, say, treason or violating sacred law.
Indiscretion.
Right. And the kicker. They retained control of the Cadmea. The military gain was politically ratified. And to cement this coup, the leading anti-Spartan polemarch in Thebes, a man named Ismenias, was arrested. He wasn't tried by Thebans, oh no. He was tried by a hand-picked court of judges from Sparta's allies, condemned on trumped-up charges of Medism, cooperating with Persia years earlier, and promptly executed.
So the legal system was just used as a convenient veneer, a tool for political assassination, basically. And this was right after the King's Peace, when Sparta was meant to be guaranteeing autonomy. That's galling. If the system is so obviously weaponized like that, how did ordinary citizens maintain any faith in it at all?
Well, maybe faith is the wrong word. Perhaps it was more about learning how to excel, or at least survive, within the system's acknowledged flaws. Which brings us right back to Athens, actually, and that famous bitter oratorical warfare between Demosthenes and Aeschylus.
Ah, yes, the heavyweights.
Their rivalry perfectly illustrates how moral character, legal arguments, accusations, everything was weaponized just to secure political survival in the public arena. Demosthenes, especially, was a master strategist. He seemed incredibly adept at leveraging political instability and, frankly, the often short memory of the average Athenian citizen for complex political events. He'd be audacious, truly audacious, in falsifying facts, particularly concerning the hugely controversial peace of Philocrates with Macedon.
Right, that peace treaty was a political minefield. What specifically was his move against Aeschines regarding the peace? How did he twist it?
Well, Demosthenes essentially tried to disclaim all personal responsibility for that peace, a peace he himself had initially promoted. He shifted the blame entirely onto Aeschines, particularly for the disastrous fate of the Phocians, who were allies of Athens, left completely abandoned to Philip of Macedon under the treaty's terms. He basically rewrote his own history in public and placed the entire burden of that failure squarely on his rival's shoulders.
Okay, that's bold. Now, Aeschines himself was also accused, wasn't he, of taking bribes from Philip of Macedon? That sounds like a career-ending charge. How did he possibly defend himself against corruption accusations that, well, might even have been true?
This gives us such a powerful insight into the moral complexities or maybe ambiguities of Athenian political life. It seems quite likely that Aeschines did take money or gifts from Philip. Yeah. Yes, but here's the thing. Public opinion at the time seemed to tolerate politicians accepting gifts from foreign powers, if those foreigners generally approved of the politicians' policies. It wasn't automatically seen as treason. So, Aeschines countered the charge not by flatly denying ever receiving anything, but by arguing that accepting these gifts did not automatically prove he had betrayed Athenian interests.
That's a clever distinction. He's redefining corruption.
Precisely. He argued, quite plausibly perhaps, that for men like him, who weren't from these super-wealthy aristocratic families, accepting such support actually allowed them to dedicate themselves fully to public affairs, which ultimately benefited Athens. The real test of treason, he claimed, wasn't whether you took money, but whether your policies had sacrificed the manifest good of the city. Just taking money wasn't in itself enough for a political death sentence in his argument.
That's a really profound strategic shift in the argument, moving it away from the act of taking money itself towards the actual consequences of the policy decisions. Very skillful.
And Aeschines was equally skilled at preemption, at turning defense into attack. You see this brilliantly in the Delphi incident. The Thebans and their allies were gearing up to hit Athens with a serious charge and likely a massive fine at the Amphictyonic Council, the religious body overseeing Delphi.
What was the charge?
The pretext was that Athens had recently rededicated some old shields in the treasury at Delphi. Shields inscribed from the spoils of Persians and Thebans. A clear historical insult to Thebes, dredging up old grievances.
Okay, so an inflammatory political move disguised as a religious act. How on earth did Aeschines deflect such a public, potentially devastating threat?
He executed an absolute masterstroke of legal and religious deflection. He didn't wait to be accused. He preempted the entire charge by launching a counterblow against the people who were actually inciting the accusation against Athens, the Locrians of Amphissa.
He went after them instead. On what grounds?
He accused Amphissa of a far greater, far more fundamental sacrilege. He accused them of cultivating sacred land, part of the accursed field near Delphi that had once belonged to the city of Crisa, destroyed centuries earlier under a sacred vow. This was a huge taboo.
Wow, so he completely shifted the focus. He basically said, you think our little shield inscription is bad? Look at these guys committing a foundational religious crime.
Exactly. His powerful oratory managed to focus the entire assembly's outrage and condemnation onto the Locrians. He turned a potentially devastating political and financial threat against Athens into a successful, self-serving religious crusade led by Athens against Amphissa. It just shows the sheer power of skillful maneuvering within that highly charged, agonistic legal and political system. It was pure political survival, utterly dependent on oratorical firepower and legal cunning.
We've just charted this incredibly personal, rhetorical, sometimes brutal, politically volatile legal system in Athens. Now let's fast forward several hundred years, change locations entirely, and look at Rome. Because here, the theme shifts dramatically, doesn't it? We seem to transition from a legal system often won by personal rhetorical skill in a public feud to one based much more on centralized bureaucratic control.
That really is the essential shift, yes. The sometimes chaotic system of the late Republic eventually gives way to the much more centralized systematic power of the empire. And the Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century CE was particularly instrumental in consolidating this power.
Diocletian.
Our sources are pretty clear that he systematically worked to strip the Senate, the old heart of the Republic, of its traditional power and influence. Partly, it seems, just out of his personal preference for efficient militarized rule and perhaps dislike for the messier aspects of traditional Roman politics in the city itself. And to really cement imperial legal authority, Diocletian understood he needed absolute military loyalty detached from the old Roman structures. So the Praetorian Guard, who had for centuries protected the emperors but also sometimes made them, well, their power was deliberately diminished.
How did he do that?
Diocletian gradually reduced their numbers, he abolished many of their traditional privileges, and he effectively replaced them as the core imperial guard, with fiercely loyal legions, recruited from his own power base in Illyricum, the Jovians and Herculeans, named after Jupiter and Hercules, the emperor's divine patrons. This physical centralization of military force was absolutely necessary to underpin the emperor's absolute authority over law and jurisdiction across the vast empire.
But the Romans were always masters of maintaining illusions, weren't they? Even as the emperors gain what looks like absolute power to dictate laws, did they keep up any kind of facade? Did they pretend the old Republican institutions still mattered?
Oh, they maintained the image almost religiously. It was crucial. Even as the emperor's real authority flowed directly from imperial edicts and, importantly, rescripts, we should talk about those laws, the laws were still, formally speaking, often ratified by the Senate.
Oh, okay.
This preserved the image of the old constitution, as one source puts it. A wise emperor understood he was obligated, publicly at least, to maintain the language and behavior suitable for the general and first magistrate of the republic. The reality was absolute imperial control dictating law, but the public language often remained nominally republican.
So in this new, highly centralized legal machine, the source of law is really shifting away from popular votes, away from those turbulent public juries we saw in Athens. Who becomes the chief agent of imperial legal power out in the vast provinces?
That immense responsibility fell primarily to the provincial governor. He was known generally by the title praeses provinciae. Now, this single title actually summarized a whole range of historical administrative roles, men who might have held titles like consul or praetor or proconsul or propraetor, but they were all acting as the head of the government district.
And the praetor, that title itself comes from the old Republican magistracy associated with justice, right?
Exactly. The institutional root of the provincial governor's power, especially his judicial power, was the old Roman praetorship, the traditional office of judicial authority back in Rome. So there's continuity in the name, even as the function transforms under the empire.
And how did this governor actually administer law across such vast, diverse territories? Was he strictly tied to the established Roman legal procedures from the Republic?
Not entirely, and that's key. He exercised his criminal jurisdiction, especially in the early empire, through a technique called cognitio. This is essentially a form of judicial inquiry conducted by the magistrate himself. Yes. And for crimes that weren't covered by the standard Roman criminal procedure, the ordo ediciorum publicorum, the governor had immense flexibility. He could rely on local customs, he could look to imperial precedent set by emperors, and he could use his own judgment, his own ingenuity.
You mentioned rescripts earlier as a source of imperial authority. Can you explain what an imperial rescript actually was in practical terms? Was it like, say, a binding Supreme Court ruling today setting broad precedent, or something different?
That's a really critical distinction to make. A rescript wasn't usually a broad constitutional ruling. It was typically an official written reply from the emperor, or often from his specialized legal office, responding to a specific legal question or a petition submitted by either a private citizen or, more often, an official like a provincial governor.
So answers to specific queries.
Exactly. They were essentially binding legal interpretations applying to very specific sets of facts presented in the query. But, and this is crucial, while they applied narrowly at first, they were collected, they were cited, and they rapidly accumulated. Over time, they formed a massive, sprawling body of imperial precedent and detailed legal guidance that effectively defined the law across the empire on countless issues.
And they bypassed local courts entirely.
In essence, yes. They made the emperor, through his legal chancery, the ultimate arbiter of legal interpretation, whose written word could override local decisions or clarify ambiguities anywhere in the empire. It was a powerful tool of centralization. And you see the sheer scope of the governor's personal power revealed quite clearly in some surviving edicts issued by Augustus for the province of Cyrene in North Africa.
What did they show?
They demonstrated that, yes, minor charges were typically left to the local courts to handle. But for serious capital charges, life and death cases involving non-citizens, the peregrini, well, while a jury system sometimes existed, perhaps with a mix of local non-citizens and resident Roman citizens, the use of that jury was explicitly stated to be optional.
Optional. The governor could just decide not to use a jury in a capital case.
That's what the edict implies. The governor, the praeses, effectively held the roles of investigator, prosecutor, and judge, all rolled into one in the cognitio process. And he seemingly had the discretion to set aside local courts, and even potentially a jury, and decide a person's life or death single-handedly, based on his own inquiry.
Wow, that represents a massive concentration of legal power, doesn't it? Shifting the real locus of decision-making away from any kind of decentralized public body squarely into the hands of a single appointed imperial official.
Absolutely, it's a fundamental shift.
So who are the people staffing this new, incredibly powerful legal bureaucracy? Was it still strictly the old Roman and Italian aristocratic families running the show?
Not exclusively, and this is another major change. The empire, especially by the 2nd century CE, realized it needed talent and efficiency, not just pedigree, to function across its vast territories. The emperors themselves increasingly came from provincial backgrounds.
Right, like Trajan and Hadrian.
Exactly. Trajan and Hadrian hailed from Spain, Antoninus Pius came from Gaul, and this trend filtered down. The highest administrative classes, the senatorial and equestrian orders, were increasingly selected for key state service roles based on demonstrable personal merits, administrative efficiency, intellectual gifts. It was evolving into an aristocracy of the empire, representing talent drawn from across the provinces, not just from Rome or Italy. Meritocracy, at least in theory, was becoming more important.
Okay, so you have these powerful governors, often from provincial backgrounds themselves, wielding immense legal and administrative power far from Rome. That sounds like a potential recipe for corruption, doesn't it? Especially if they get too cozy with local elites and wealthy provinces. Did the central Roman government try to put strict legal restrictions on these officials to prevent that?
Oh, they were intensely concerned about exactly that, preventing local loyalties or entanglements from overriding imperial authority and interests. And our sources reveal some really fascinating, very specific legal restrictions designed to keep governors detached.
Like what?
Well, for instance, a Roman official administering an office in a particular province was strictly forbidden by law from marrying a woman who originated from or was currently living in that province.
Really? A flat ban on marrying locals while in office? Why such a specific rule?
The clear intent seems to have been to prevent the official from establishing deep, personal, local ties through marriage alliances. Think about the powerful families, the complex property arrangements, the dowries involved. They feared these connections might compromise his impartiality, make him too susceptible to local political pressures, or worse, encourage corruption and favoritism toward his new in-laws. He had to remain, legally and socially, an outsider representing Rome, not becoming a local magnate himself.
Could they get around this rule at all? Was there any flexibility?
There was a little. The law apparently allowed an official to become betrothed to a local woman while serving in the province. But the actual marriage ceremony could only take place after he had officially laid down his office and presumably left the province.
Interesting loophole.
And even more interestingly, the law did not seem to prevent the official from marrying his own daughters into prominent families within the province while he was still governor. He could even constitute a dowry for them from his own property.
So it was okay for his daughters to form local ties, but not for him directly.
It seems so. It suggests the primary concern, the legal paranoia, was specifically focused on preventing the male official himself from becoming personally, financially, and politically bound to the province he governed through his own marriage. And beyond these specific rules, you have to remember that every aspect of the emperor's staff and his public appearance was designed to project imperial glory and undisputed legal authority. He was attended by officials carrying the consular fasces, those bundles of rods, sometimes with an axe, symbolizing the ultimate power over life and death.
The symbols of power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he had official messengers, the viators, and a herald, the praetor, who would make public announcements. These weren't just for the emperor. Similar attendants served high magistrates like consuls and praetors too.
And these outward signs of authority, they were obviously highly scrutinized. They could backfire if not handled correctly.
Definitely. The sources give us a great example with the Emperor Domitian. He faced heavy criticism for what was seen as his arrogance because apparently he sometimes communicated with the crowds solely through his herald, even ordering silence through the herald rather than speaking himself. This was perceived as a deliberate, excessive display of reserve and distance. It contrasted sharply with the preferred image, cultivated by emperors like Augustus, of the emperor engaging more directly with the public, listening to petitions, maybe even answering questions in person. Getting the performance of power right was crucial.
Okay, fascinating stuff on the imperial structure. Now let's dive into the foundational layer beneath all this. Roman private law itself. This is arguably where Rome left its most enduring legacy to the Western world, isn't it? And it really shows that Roman obsession with absolute precision in legal language.
It truly does. Roman jurisprudence, especially in the classical period, developed what scholars have called a remarkable historical self-consciousness. It was driven by this deep-seated, almost obsessive concern with the capacity of legal language to precisely describe, categorize, and ultimately regulate the entire social and economic world. They believed law could and should map onto reality with precision. And this focus wasn't just on the words on the page, but on their practical effect. It's captured perfectly by the famous statement from the jurist Celsus. To know the laws, he said, is not merely to grasp their words, but their force and power. Vim ac potestatem.
Their force and power, so understanding how the law actually worked in society, what it enabled, what it constrained.
Exactly. The true knowledge wasn't just memorizing statutes, it was understanding their functional impact.
And that focus on underlying function, on vim ac potestatem, is what gave us some fundamental legal distinctions that still shape our own legal systems today. Most notably, perhaps, that crucial boundary between ownership and possession. Why was getting that distinction right so critical for the Roman legal elite?
It was absolutely essential for stabilizing complex economic relationships, especially involving property and credit. They maintained a very sharp, carefully defined distinction between having a proprietary right, which is actual legal ownership, and having mere physical control, which is possession. They weren't always the same thing.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A classic one is the creditor who received an asset, say a piece of jewelry, as a pledge, as security for a loan. That creditor clearly had physical control of the jewelry, but Roman law explicitly stated they were not considered the legal possessor in the full sense.
Okay, so if I hold your ring as collateral for a loan you owe me, I physically possess it, but legally I'm not the possessor. What's the practical consequence of that distinction? Why does it matter?
It dictates crucial things, like who has the legal rights and remedies if the item is stolen from the creditor or damaged. It determines who bears the risk. And fundamentally, it prevents the creditor, who only has temporary control for security, from acting like the owner, for instance. They couldn't legally sell the ring or give it away while holding it as a pledge.
Ah, okay. It protects the original owner's rights.
Precisely. Similarly, someone who only had a use of fruit that's the right to use and enjoy the benefits of a property, like harvesting the fruit from an orchard owned by someone else, that person was also not legally defined as the possessor of the land itself. This kind of nuanced precision allowed complex financial instruments, leases, loans, and asset management to function much more smoothly, without constantly collapsing into disputes about who truly owned what. Mastering these precise legal terms was a massive source of power for the legal elite, managing the intricate Roman economy.
Shifting from property to people, Roman law also, as we know, placed very explicit and detailed restrictions on the public and legal actions of women. And these laws reflect some deeply ingrained societal views, don't they?
They offer a very stark reflection of the patriarchal structure of Roman society, absolutely. For instance, women were specifically prohibited by law from defending other people in court. They couldn't act as legal advocates for someone else.
Why not? What was the reasoning?
This ban was directly linked in the sources to a broader legal principle established by the Senatus Consultum Bellianum. This was a decree that imposed a general ban on women interceding for another party, particularly in ways that involved taking on financial obligations or risks for them.
Okay, but how was defending someone in court equated with taking on a financial risk?
Because, under Roman procedural law, acting as a formal legal defender for someone often meant formally undertaking the legal obligation of the person you represented. If the case was lost, the defender themselves could potentially undergo condemnation and become personally liable for paying the damages or penalty.
Ah, I see. So because defending someone could lead to personal financial liability, and women were generally barred from taking on such liabilities for others.
Exactly. They were therefore forbidden from acting as defenders, and this prohibition was quite specific. A woman was forbidden from defending even her closest male relatives, her husband, her son, or her father.
Even her own family.
Wow. Yes. And beyond the courtroom defense, they were also typically denied the right to bring what were called popular actions. These were lawsuits brought ostensibly in the public interest, not just for personal redress, unless the matter strictly and personally pertained to her own rights or property. Their sphere of legal action was deliberately constrained. Furthermore, in matters touching on status and family structure, the law actively intervened to maintain the established social hierarchy. For example, Roman society, and eventually the law, strongly disapproved of women freeing their own slaves, specifically for the purpose of marrying them. This was seen as blurring status lines inappropriately.
So it wasn't just social disapproval, it became legally problematic.
Yes, especially later Roman law, particularly from the 4th century CE onwards, explicitly addressed and condemned the situation where a free woman was found to be living in a stable, quasi-marital union with her own male slave without having first formally manumitted, freed him, and then legally married him. Legal status, determined by law, was paramount, overriding even personal relationships if they didn't conform to the correct legal categories.
Okay, let's turn finally to a cornerstone of commercial life and security, the Roman contract of surety. The idea of having a guarantor, or fideiusor as they called it. How did this complex system of guaranteeing obligations actually work in practice?
The fideiusor, the surety or guarantor, was absolutely essential for binding obligations securely and providing the confidence needed for commerce and lending to flourish. It underpinned a huge amount of economic activity, and the general principle was remarkably broad and flexible. How so? A surety, a fideiusor, could be taken for essentially any kind of legal obligation. It didn't matter if the main obligation arose from a real contract, like a loan, a verbal contract, like a formal promise or stipulatio, or a consensual contract, like sale or hire. You could even add a surety to guarantee a praetorian obligation, one created by the praetor's edict. And remarkably, you could even add a surety after the formal joining of issue, litis contestatio, and a lawsuit had already occurred.
Wow, so you could bring in a cosigner almost any time, even mid-lawsuit, to back up a potential debt or judgment. That's very flexible. Did the surety, the fideiusor, have to accept the exact same terms and conditions as the main person they were guaranteeing, the principal debtor?
Now that brings us to a really critical principle governing suretyship, focused on conditionality and fairness to the surety. The key rule was this. A surety was legally not bound if the terms of his obligation were somehow more stringent or more legally onerous than the obligation of the principal debtor he's guaranteeing.
Okay, can you give an example of more stringent?
Sure. Let's say the principal debtor was only conditionally liable, for instance. Maybe they only had to pay if a certain ship arrived safely. The surety could not legally be accepted if they offered an unqualified, unconditional promise to pay, regardless of whether the ship arrived. That would be making the surety's position worse than the debtor's.
That makes perfect sense. The guarantor shouldn't be put in a worse legal position than the person whose debt they're actually backing up.
Exactly. The law aimed to protect the surety from being trapped in a harsher deal. However, the reverse situation was perfectly acceptable. The surety could be accepted on terms that were less stringent than the principal debtor's obligation.
How would that work?
Well, if the principal debtor was unconditionally liable to pay on demand, the surety could validly promise to pay only conditionally, say, only if the debtor defaulted after 6 months, or perhaps guarantee only part of the debt, or guarantee payment only from a specific future date. The flexibility mostly worked one way to potentially lighten the surety's burden, not increase it compared to the main debtor. The underlying purpose here was clearly protective, to ensure the surety wasn't unfairly penalized, and therefore to make the whole system of providing guarantees attractive and workable enough to keep commerce flowing reliably.
This has been a truly fascinating, comprehensive deep dive. We've really covered a vast historical arc here, haven't we? We started way back with the highly personal, intensely rhetorical, and deeply political nature of law in Athens. Where, as you said, mastering sophistry, proving your civic worth through liturgies, that was absolutely central to winning a lawsuit, which was often just a continuation of a feud. Then we journeyed forward into the expansive, incredibly centralized legal framework of the Roman Empire, where power wasn't so much about winning a single debate, but about exercising bureaucratic control, wielding the authority of imperial rescripts, and leveraging the immense judicial flexibility of the governor's cognitio.
And the key takeaway, I think, becomes starkly clear across both these different worlds. In both Greece and Rome, political power was just inextricably, fundamentally linked to legal literacy and control over judicial roles. It didn't matter if it was the skill needed for rhetorical manipulation of an archaic law like apodophoro back in democratic Athens,
Right.
or if it was the imperial bureaucracy's ability, centuries later, to define through law who could marry whom in a distant province. In both systems, the ruling class was fundamentally defined by its mastery, its control, and its deployment of the laws it enforced. Law was power.
And as we wrapped up our discussion in Rome, we saw that this entire system, everything from private contracts between individuals right up to grand imperial decrees, was rooted in this really extraordinary dedication to legal formalism. Precision in language, precise categories.
You did indeed. And we even saw that this Roman tendency, this almost obsessive focus on getting the form right, it extended beyond secular law. The old Roman practice viewed religion itself as almost quasi-contractual. It was often characterized by what scholars call a hard formalism that closely mirrored their legal system. Think of the precise wording needed for vows or the exact rituals for public prayers, the voto publica.
They treated their relationship with the gods almost like a legal contract.
In many ways, yes. It often felt like they approached the divine relationship as a kind of strict legal bargain. Knowing the precise formularies, the correct words and actions, was seen as paramount to fulfilling your side of the deal and therefore compelling the gods to fulfill theirs and grant favor.
That structural rigidity, that legalistic formalism, applied just as much to the gods as it did to commercial contracts. That raises a really interesting final question, perhaps, for you, the listener, to think about. If the Roman state's official, formalized religious and legal system was so deeply concerned with strict adherence to form, with getting the procedures exactly right, what happens when that very system, because of its rigidity, inevitably fails to satisfy the deeper human need for religio? That more natural, visceral feeling of connection, the need for personal support and comfort from the unseen.
Well, the sources, and history itself, suggest that failure eventually led directly to a major cultural and religious shift. That hard formalism, while perhaps effective for state rituals, ultimately created a kind of spiritual vacuum for many individuals. And that vacuum over time was increasingly filled by the importation and embrace of new, non-Roman gods, philosophies, and especially the mystery cults, and eventually, of course, Christianity. These offered a more personal, emotional, and perhaps less legalistic connection to the divine, precisely because the old formalized, quasi-legal approach had lost its power to speak meaningfully to the truly anxious, searching Roman mind.
A system perhaps too rigid, too formalized, eventually invited its own transformation or even replacement. A powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the intricate connections between law and power in antiquity. We really hope you feel much better informed and maybe even inspired to explore how other formalized systems throughout history might have eventually given way to a need for deeper, more personal meaning. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.